Hi guys, Yuri K here. In today's video, I will discuss carbohydrates. I will discuss what carbohydrates are and how they affect us. Let's first begin by defining what a carbohydrate is. A carbohydrate is a biological molecule consisting of three atoms, which are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, with the hydrogen to oxygen atom ratio primarily at 2 to 1, such as in water. Carbohydrates are the primary source of energy that a person obtains from their diet. Energy can also be obtained from proteins and fats. However, carbohydrates, in most people, are the preferred source of energy. In terms of science, a carbohydrate can be described as a saccharide, which is comprised of monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides and disaccharides are primarily sugars, monosaccharides being glucose and fructose, and disaccharides being sucrose. Oligosaccharides and polysaccharides are primarily the complex carbohydrates. From a dietary standpoint, carbohydrates can be categorized in two ways: simple carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are primarily sugars, and complex carbohydrates are the other more complex types of foods, such as grains, fruits, vegetables, as well as legumes. When carbohydrates are consumed, they will be converted to glucose in the blood for an immediate source of energy. Glucose is the body's preferred source of energy. However, the rate at which the carbohydrates break down into glucose will be affected by a number of factors, such as the other foods that we eat, the time of day that we eat our foods, as well as our physical activity and individual metabolic rates. For example, foods with a high glycemic index, which I'll cover in a later video, will increase the body's glucose levels more than foods with a low glycemic index. The body only needs a certain amount of energy in order to maintain its vital functioning, which comes from the glucose. When we have glucose in our blood, our brain sends a signal to the pancreas to create a hormone known as insulin. Insulin's main purpose is to control and regulate our blood glucose levels. Glucose will first be used for energy, and insulin's responsibility is to transport the glucose into our cells in order to be burned up and used as energy. The second part is when we consume excess glucose, the insulin will transport that glucose into our skeletal muscles and to our liver to be stored as a temporary source of energy, also known as glycogen, through a process known as glycogenesis. The average person can store about 200 to 400 grams of glycogen in their skeletal muscles and about 70 to 100 grams of glycogen in their liver. Once the glycogen stores are maxed out, the body, by way of insulin, will then move the excess glucose into another area of the body to be stored as energy. And guess what that is? Fat, also known as adipose tissue. So by consuming an excessive number of carbohydrates, the body will end up storing the energy as excess fat. Whereas carbohydrates are quickly broken down into glucose for energy and are their body's preferred energy source, proteins and fats can also be broken down and converted into glucose, although at a slower rate. For example, about 50% of the protein in our foods can be broken down into glucose. This is an important factor to consider in our diets because we want to maintain a balanced proportion of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. For example, if we consume too many carbohydrates all at one time, such as by eating in excessive amounts of candies or chocolates, the result will be that we can enter into what's called a blood sugar spike. And that is when we have excess glucose in our blood. So again, the body's going to react by having the brain give the pancreas a signal to secrete insulin. And insulin's main job is to maintain blood glucose levels at a low level. It doesn't want extra glucose out there in the blood. it wants to transport it out of the system as quickly as possible and utilize it for energy otherwise. When we use up that available glucose for energy, our body enters into a process called a blood sugar crash, which means our glucose levels become too low. And unfortunately, it takes time for our brain to realize this and to signal to our pancreas to stop producing insulin. So when this gap occurs, we enter into a situation where we don't have enough glucose and we need to find an alternate source of energy. In a person that has a well-working and efficient metabolism, the body will be able to, as mentioned before, get its energy from glycogen. However, in a person that has a poorly working metabolism, the body will have a difficulty in getting the glycogen for energy. So it's going to go into a crash, and the body will need to be resupplied with sugar immediately in order to keep it functioning. So such a person may need to consume a fruit juice or a quick shot of candies or a fruit, for example. We don't want these blood sugar spikes and crashes to happen in our body, and for that reason we want to maintain a healthy and balanced diet with the right proportions of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Ideally, we want to maintain our body in an insulin-sensitive state, which means that when we consume carbohydrates, our body needs to only produce a small amount of insulin in order to regulate our blood glucose levels. When we have too many blood sugar spikes and crashes, and our pancreas is overreacting and producing too much insulin, eventually it can stress the organ. And as a result, our body can become insulin insensitive, which is what we don't want. Which means that now when we consume carbohydrates, either our pancreas is not producing enough insulin, or it produces insulin, however, it is not able to effectively manage the glucose and get it out of our blood, resulting in an excessive blood sugar level for an extended period of time. This can have negative implications and ultimately result in type 2 diabetes. Again, as I mentioned before, we want to maintain our body in a healthy state and eat the right proportions of healthy foods with the proper balance of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. We want to try to avoid highly processed foods and try to eat foods in their natural and raw state when possible. Again, this is carbohydrates in a nutshell, and I hope you guys liked the video. Please give me a thumbs up. Please comment, share the video, and subscribe. And stay tuned for more. And remember to follow me down in the info box below at UriK0877. Thanks, guys. Bye.